What would it feel like to be promised to a man you've never met before you could even walk? In medieval Europe, that wasn't a question. It was reality. For most women of the Middle Ages, marriage was not an act of love or personal choice. It was a transaction, a binding contract determined by family interests, social position, and economic gain. Among the nobility, daughters were political tools, exchanged like assets to seal alliances, expand territories, or secure peace. Girls could be betrothed as young as 7, and by 12, they were considered of marital age under church law. In December, jurist Guillaume Durand noted bluntly, "Marriage is not a matter of love, but of property and law." And for peasant women, the freedom to choose was no greater. Lordly consent often overruled personal desire, and marriages could be arranged to benefit the feudal economy more than the family itself. Consent, though legally required by the church, was often no more than a formality. A young girl surrounded by male relatives and clergy was expected to obey, regardless of fear or resistance. The historian Eileen Power, examining court rolls and ecclesiastical records, found numerous cases where women were coerced into marriage or later claimed they had never consented at all. Some were taken by force, others under threat, and many simply had no voice in the decision made on their behalf. Once married, a woman's autonomy disappeared almost entirely. Legally, she was femme covert, a status under which her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently, sue in court, or even leave her household without permission. In England, Magna Carta offered no rights to women, and canon law reinforced male dominance, citing Genesis, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." In this grim social framework, marriage became a prison cloaked in sacrament. Love was neither sought nor expected. Women, particularly young girls, were bartered, bound, and forgotten, often before they fully understood what marriage even meant. Childbirth dangers, the silent killer of women. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not a moment of joy. It was a deadly gamble. For women, it was often the most dangerous event they would ever face. Without anesthesia, antiseptics, or trained medical professionals, labor was a brutal and unpredictable ordeal. Women delivered children at home, usually aided by midwives, women with practical experience but little formal training. Even among nobility, the risks were staggering. For peasants whose lives were harder and bodies worn from endless labor and malnutrition, the dangers multiplied. Mortality rates speak volumes. By some estimates, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 births resulted in the mother's death. Complications like obstructed labor, hemorrhage, puerperal fever, childbed fever, and infections frequently proved fatal. There were no cesarean sections, not for living women. If a cesarean was performed, it was only to save the child after the mother had died or was beyond hope. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and medical writer, described childbirth with grim realism. When the child is born, the woman's life stands on the edge of a knife. If her strength fails, she is taken, and many were. In the absence of germ theory, cleanliness was poor. Midwives reused tools, and even noble births occurred in unsanitary conditions, sometimes in straw-strewn chambers teeming with bacteria. Beyond the physical trauma was the spiritual fear. The church taught that dying in childbirth without having confessed one's sins could imperil the soul. Priests were sometimes summoned to a woman in labor, not to offer congratulations, but last rites. Still, women bore child after child. Marriage meant procreation, and a woman's status, even her salvation, was often linked to fertility. Noble women might endure 10 or more pregnancies in pursuit of a male heir. The English Queen Anne Neville, wife of Richard III, died in 1485, likely from tuberculosis worsened by childbirth complications. Her fate was far from unique. Each birth could be a death sentence, yet there was no choice. In the medieval world, motherhood was expected and survival was never guaranteed. Harsh punishments, the dark reality of medieval justice. Justice in the medieval world was swift, brutal, and merciless, especially for women. In a society where law was rooted in feudal custom, church doctrine, and patriarchal control, punishment served less to rehabilitate and more to terrify. Women were not judged by the same standards as men. While the laws in many kingdoms, such as England's common law or France's customary codes, nominally applied to all, their enforcement was deeply gendered. Women accused of moral or intimate offenses faced disproportionately harsh treatment. Adultery, promiscuity, or even suspected immodesty could result in public humiliation, corporal punishment, or worse. In the 13th century, English records show women convicted of adultery paraded through streets wearing nothing but their smocks, heads shaved, jeered by crowds. More severe accusations brought crueler ends. For theft, mutilation was common, ears cut off, faces branded, or fingers removed. The punishment was often worse for women because of the added element of shame. In 1324, a woman in Paris named Jeanne de Brigue, known as a soothsayer, was burned alive for supposed sorcery and theft. Her gender cited as part of her inherent deceitfulness. The church had its own courts, especially in cases of morality. Accused of fornication, blasphemy, or heresy, women were dragged before ecclesiastical judges who seldom offered mercy. A female voice raised in defiance, whether in word or intellect, was seen as inherently suspect. A talkative woman is like a leaking roof, warned the 12th century Decretum Gratiani. A foundation of canon law, silence and obedience were divine virtues. Dissent was sin. Torture, though regulated in theory, was applied to extract confessions. Women were often more vulnerable due to their lower legal standing. Records from inquisitorial courts show that many confessed simply to end the torment, sealing their fates. Once accused, a woman had few options. She could be dunked, flogged, pilloried, or executed, all often in public, all to make an example. Justice in medieval Europe was not blind. It saw women all too clearly and punished them accordingly. Fear and persecution. Women in the medieval witch hunts. In the late medieval world, fear took shape in the form of a woman. Across villages and cities, the figure of the witch became a symbol of all that society feared, and women paid the price. While the most notorious witch hunts peaked in the early modern period, their roots lay deep in the medieval imagination. Influenced by centuries of theological suspicion, folk belief, and misogyny, accusations of witchcraft emerged as explanations for misfortune, crop failure, disease, infant mortality. Someone had to be blamed, and that someone was often an older, poor, or isolated woman. The church played a decisive role. The 1487 publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, translated The Hammer of Witches by Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, cemented the association between witchcraft and female evil. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, it claimed. Though technically an early modern text, its foundations were laid by medieval ecclesiastical authorities. Theologians had long described women as spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, and therefore more susceptible to demonic influence. Trials offered little hope of escape. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions. A woman might be accused by a neighbor after a quarrel or a miscarriage of a child. She could then be imprisoned, interrogated, and forced under agony to confess to flying on broomsticks, consorting with demons, or cursing livestock. The more she denied it, the more she was tortured. Execution followed swiftly. In much of Europe, burning was the preferred method, not for spectacle alone, but as a purifying act. The flames were believed to cleanse the soul, though no such mercy existed in the act itself. Town squares became theaters of horror. The smell of smoke, the roar of crowds, and the screams of the condemned etched these events into communal memory and reinforced the terror. Most victims were women. Between 75% to 85% of the accused across medieval and early modern Europe were female. They were not criminals. They were scapegoats, victims of fear, ignorance, and a system that weaponized religion and law to control the most vulnerable. The witch hunts were not just acts of persecution. They were social panic institutionalized, and for medieval women, they marked one of the darkest legacies of all. The medieval world was not simply cruel by accident. It was structured to bind women to silence, suffering, and servitude. These systems of control were not isolated events. They reflected the deep fears, rigid hierarchies, and religious ideologies that shaped European civilization for centuries. In every forced marriage, every deathbed delivery, every unjust sentence, and every flamelit execution, we see how gendered power distorted justice and dignity. History does not sleep. It speaks through the scars it leaves behind. How do we measure the cost of a society built on silence? Comment below or outgo what aspect of medieval womanhood do you think most shaped the structure of society in that time? As the 12th century chronicler Audric Vitalis once observed, the customs of the time were more cruel to women than to men, for they bore burdens without reward and died without glory.